So we're going to be looking at Andrew Jackson's relationship to the Native Americans in this particular installment, really focusing on the Indian Removal Act, but it's helpful to give context. So here's actually a political cartoon that shows Andrew Jackson as this great father, and you're looking at him holding Native Americans in his arms, and Native Americans sort of sitting around his chair, looking up to him, not necessarily in an antagonistic way. And the Andrew Jackson we see has a very antagonistic relationship, it seems, with Native Americans, but the story is slightly more complicated. Believe it or not, about 20 years before the Trail of Tears was really happening, Andrew Jackson and his wife adopted a Creek, okay, again, a Native American tribe orphan named Lincoya. And in some ways, history is like, was it sort of like almost like a pet? I know that sounds terrible to say. But in the end, ended up being sort of seen as a pretty important member of the family before dying at a pretty young age. Now, something we will not cover in class is his efforts as part of the War of 1812. It was sort of an offshoot of the War of 1812, Battle of Horseshoe Bend, where he really helped remove Native Americans so that whites could settle there. Then famously in the Battle of New Orleans, that helped sort of save that tie against the British in the War of 1812. He actually has a number of Native Americans that are part of the troops that he's fighting alongside. And then after the War of 1812, he actually helps defeat sort of Seminoles as they are living in Spanish Florida. So again, he has defeated, in often cases very brutally, Native Americans. He's adopted a Native American orphan, and he's fought alongside them. So by the time he comes to the presidency in 1828 as this military hero, this rags to riches story, he's got sort of a real mix in terms of what his relationship with Native Americans has been like. Now, I'm actually going to go through 4 slides worth of this particular address. And I think it's really important in terms of understanding, is Andrew Jackson really somebody who supports Native Americans as we think about the Indian removal, or is somebody who is opposed to them, or is it somewhere in the middle? And again, as we read this is again in his first year of his presidency. Remember, he was elected in 1828, but he came, into office in 1829, as all presidents do. So I'm going to go through it, and then I'm going to sort of break it down. So the condition and ulterior destiny of the Indian tribes within the limits of some of our states have become objects of much interest and importance. It has long been the policy of government to introduce among them the art of civilization, the hope of gradually reclaiming them from a wandering life. So what he's essentially saying here is we want them to assimilate. We don't want them to be these nomads. We want them to adopt white ways, and we think that that is going to make them more civilized and sort of quote unquote better Americans, even though they've never wanted to be Americans. But he says a portion of the southern tribes, having mingled much with whites and made some progress in the art of civilized life, have lately attempted to erect an independent government within the limits of Georgia and Alabama. These states, claiming to be the only sovereigns within their territory, extend their laws over the Indians, which induce the latter to call upon the United States for protection. So I'll talk to you about these tribes when we're done, but really known as the 5 civilized tribes, the sort of most noteworthy among them, the Cherokee. And they have their own constitution, and they basically say, we are our own sovereign country with our own laws. And then states like Georgia and Alabama say, no, we're sovereign states within a sovereign country. You cannot actually exercise your own control. And so they have this tension. And ultimately, the Native Americans appeal to the U.S. government, and we will talk much more about that in a case called Cherokee Nation v. Georgia. Under these circumstances, the question is presented whether the general government, that's the federal government, has a right to sustain those people and their pretensions, basically saying, can you allow Native Americans to form their own governments within the states? The Constitution declares that no new state shall be formed or erected within the jurisdiction of any other state without the consent of its legislature. So you can't just form a new state within an existing state. If the general government is not permitted to tolerate the erection of a Confederate state within the territory of one of its members of the Union against her consent, much less could it allow a foreign independent government. So what they're saying essentially here is, if you can't form a state within a state, you certainly cannot have a sovereign government within a state, which is what, again, the Cherokee were claiming to be. So he's setting up a legal basis for why the Cherokee cannot have the rights that they're saying that they should have. So he says Georgia as a state. Alabama is a state. Like, they're officially states. All right, we got that, right? And then he says, would the people of Maine permit the Penobscot tribe to erect an independent government, sort of using an older Native American group that we see going all the way back to New England, way back into the 1600s, and say, no. Like, that's ridiculous. We would never have that happen. He says, actuated by this view of the subject, I informed the Indians inhabiting parts of Georgia and Alabama that their attempt to establish an independent government would not be countenanced by me, would not be allowed by me as president, and advised them to emigrate beyond the Mississippi or submit to the laws of those states. So what he's effectively saying is either you do what Georgia and Alabama say, or you better go the other way, namely west, and get out. So if you're willing to be, good Indians, pardon my language, but I'm doing air quotes, you can't see them, of course, then you can stay. If you're going to resist, and you're going to, continue to perpetuate this idea of a sovereign, then you got to get out. Our conduct, and he's talking about white people here, towards these people is deeply interesting to our national character. Their present condition, contrasted with what they once were, makes a most powerful appeal to our sympathies. Our ancestors found them the uncontrolled possessors of these vast regions. By persuasion and force, they've been made to retire from river to river and from mountain to mountain until some of the tribes have become extinct and others have left but remnants to preserve for a while their once terrible names. So what they're effectively saying here is he's admitting, yeah, this is a really sordid history. And, if we look back, they were here, they had the land, and we can go all the way through, steps 1 through 6 that we've talked about, not the Pan-Indian Alliance. But he's saying, they've been cheated out of their land. They've been forced to move. And you're wondering, why is he saying this? Like, didn't he just say, you got to be quote unquote good Indians and stay here? Well, you'll see. So surrounded by the whites with their arts of civilization, which by destroying the resources of the savage doom him to weakness and decay. So effectively admitting that there is a chance that, you've reduced Native Americans by bringing white culture into them. And then he references tribes that have become much weaker, like the Mohegan, the Narragansett, actually, who were part of the fighting in going into Bacon's Rebellion, and the Delaware. Oh, my feelings about the word Delaware, is fast overtaking the Choctaw, the Cherokee, and the Creek. Those are 3 of the 5 civilized tribes we're going to talk about. That this fate surely awaits them if they remain within the limits of the states does not admit a doubt. Okay? So he says, humanity and national honor demand that every effort should be made to avert so great a calamity. So he's effectively saying, we've seen what had happened to these northeastern tribes, these Virginia tribes. Well, we can't have this happen to these southeastern tribes. So again, you're wondering, is he sympathetic? Is he want to protect them? What's he going to do? But he says a state cannot be dismembered by Congress. Okay, so again, a state can't be broken up. And a state can't be told what to do. Again, this is part of his whole states' rights argument. But the people of those states and of every state, actuated by feelings of justice and a regard for the national honor, submit to you the interesting question whether something cannot be done consistent with the rights of the states to preserve this much injured race. So he's saying, you know what? States can't be told what to do, but states have come to us nonetheless, and they're wondering, how are you going to resolve this issue of Native American tribes effectively saying we're our own nation? As a means of effecting this end, trying to resolve this, I suggest for your consideration the propriety of setting apart an ample district, this Indian territory, it'll be called, west of the Mississippi, and without the limits of any state or territory. So it's going to be a new place to be guaranteed to the Indian tribes so long as they should want it. Oh, wow. Just think about that, So long as they shall want it. And we'll find out if that's actually true, Now, there they may be secured the enjoyment of governments of their own choice. They can do what they want, subject to no other control from the United States, except to make sure that there's peace on the frontier and make sure the tribes don't fight, There, the benevolent may endeavor to teach them the arts of civilization. What they're saying here is, hey, white Christian missionaries, if you want to go help them out over there, you can. And we'll see that in just a second about the tension that had occurred there. And by promoting union and harmony among them to raise an interesting commonwealth designed to perpetuate the race and to attest the humanity and justice of this government. So look at us. We're such a great government that we're going to move them from their ancestral homes to a place that they've never been, but we'll give it to them forever and ever, and people can go there and do what they want, and we'll feel good about ourselves. But this is where it gets interesting. He says, this emigration shall be voluntary, as in you don't have to do it. for it would be as cruel as unjust to compel the Aborigines to abandon the graves of their fathers and seek a home in a distant land. Okay, so you're not going to make a move. But they should be distinctly informed that if they remain within the limits of the states, then they have to do what the states tell them to do. In return for their obedience as individuals, they will, without doubt, be protected in the enjoyments of those possessions which they've improved by their industry. But it seems to me visionary to suppose that in this state of things, claims can be allowed on tracts of country on which they have neither dwelt nor made improvements, merely because they have seen them from the mountain or passed them in the chase. So again, he says they should go voluntarily. We can't make them go. But if they stay, they have to be quote unquote good Indians, and they can't just have this land because they've been here forever because they haven't quote improved it. Now that's a very white sort of, Anglo idea that the Native Americans aren't actually doing anything to it, and the whites are the only ones that actually do something to it, particularly in terms of like growing crops and building stuff. And the natives would say like, no, we are one with the land. Okay. So what we're talking about here, as you look, it's mostly in Georgia, some in Alabama, and then goes up a little bit into Tennessee and North Carolina, what we call the 5 civilized tribes, 4 C's, 1 S, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Seminole. We're going to look at the Cherokee because they're really the ones that brought the cases to the Supreme Court. And what's fascinating about them is they had a written constitution, which I was talking about. That's part of what prompted all of this, this address by Andrew Jackson in the first place. They created an alphabet. They were farmers, so they were not nomads. They actually lived a very white lifestyle, and they owned slaves. So nothing is more white at this point than owning slaves. They completely assimilated. They assimilated so much that they effectively did what, whites would do. They created their own government. And in the end, that proved to be their downfall because they wanted to protect themselves from the states. And unfortunately, something really attractive was on that Indian land. No one would have cared about the Native Americans had they not had something attractive. First, it was cotton growing land, very fertile area here. Remember, we're just a couple decades, from Eli Whitney's famed cotton gin, and also gold is found. And we have to keep remembering that anytime gold is found, it's going to really put Native Americans at a disadvantage, even if it is their ancestral land or land that they've been moved on to by treaty. So the Cherokees fight back in court. And so in between when Andrew Jackson made this speech and them fighting back in court, you had the Indian Removal Act, which effectively said exactly what Jackson had told them, which is basically, you're going to have to move. And it didn't make it voluntary. Basically said, you have to. So in Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, the Cherokee Nation basically say, listen, we're our own country. We formed our own constitution. And now the state of Georgia is telling us what we can and can't do within our own land, which happens to be within their land. So if we are our own country within their boundaries, they shouldn't be able to tell us what to do. We have our own constitution. Now, here you've got John Marshall. Again, John Marshall was, anti-Jefferson back in the day. Throughout the era of good feelings, he's keeping federalism alive. And here he is facing sort of the new Jefferson in terms of the guy that's supporting the dirty, dusty farmers. And he says to the Cherokees, and I'm paraphrasing it, like, I want to help you. I really, really want to help you. But here's the deal. I don't want to help Georgia. I don't want to help Andrew Jackson, but my hands are tied. You're what I'm thinking is like a domestic dependent nation. You're not really a state. You're not really a foreign country. It's sort of like we're like babysitting you a little bit. I mean, that's effectively what he says, like a ward to its guardian. So under the rules that we have in which we can take cases, we can't accept your case. So he basically is like, I'd like to help you, but I can't because you're your own thing. And it's just not possible for us as a Supreme Court to deal with this case. So that is quite a win for Georgia. It's like, told you Native Americans, we can do what we want. The Supreme Court can't even help you. But then Georgia pushed it a little further. Georgia was sort of riding high on all this, and they go, well, we're going to prohibit Christian missionaries from coming onto Native American land. Again, these Christian missionaries that Jackson had referenced in his address, people that were sympathetic to Native Americans, were trying to help them. And the Cherokee say, Georgia cannot make laws about who can and can't come onto our land. And in this case, Marshall's like, ha ha, okay, I couldn't help you with the previous one, but here's the deal, okay? I know that you are your own distinct community with your own territory, and the state of Georgia has no ability to enforce this law, okay? So he uses a very interesting sort of legal chain logic here. He basically says, if Georgia can't make laws about you, okay, then the US government cannot make laws about you, which means that that whole Indian Removal Act doesn't affect you. You don't have to move. So they went from this case about Christian missionaries on Cherokee land all the way to, and you won't have to move. So it's like huge win for the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, the Seminole. It's like, yes, we don't have to move. Jackson famously sort of makes a comment like this. We don't know exactly the words he used. We've seen it sort of boiled down to what you'll often see, but I'm paraphrasing that paraphrasing. It's like, ha ha, Marshall, that's so funny. You and your silly little Supreme Court. I've got an army. I am the commander in chief of an army. I'm the chief executive, and I want them moved. So what are you going to do about it, Mr. Marshall? Ha ha ha. Indian removal is still happening. So even though the Supreme Court ruled in Worcester v. Georgia, I know it looks like Worcester v. Georgia, didn't help the Native Americans, okay? So Andrew Jackson effectively overrules a branch that is supposedly a co-equal to his. Judicial, legislative, executive also is to be co-equals. So what you're going to see is over the course of the 1830s, the Choctaw are the first to go to what is now Oklahoma. The Cherokee are the last to go, pretty much. The Seminole, actually, some take off for Florida and are way down in the Everglades and literally live there for a long time, sort of living off the land. But generally speaking, over the course of the 1830s, all of these tribes are moved from their ancestral land in the southeast to a very, very different sort of topography and climate in Oklahoma. And they go because they realize that the writing is on the wall. And in some cases, a number of sort of smaller groups within the tribes get deals, they get bribed by the government, and they say, we're speaking for everybody, even though they really weren't. Now, the Trail of Tears is known as a true low point in American history. I mean, the name literally is the Trail of Tears. And here's an image really of, old and young, some on foot, some on horse, some on wagon, sort of making that trek. And again, I'll show you, it's quite a long trek. And certainly you have to cross the Mississippi, which is a challenge to get to Oklahoma. Now, Tocqueville, who we actually read about in terms of his comments on democracy in this chapter, but he said in the whole scene, there was an air of ruin and destruction, something which betrayed a final and irrevocable adieu. One couldn't watch without feeling one's heart wrung. The Indians were tranquil, but somber and taciturn. There was one who could speak English, and of whom I asked why the Choctaws were leaving their country. To be free, he answered. Could never get any other reason out of him. We watched the expulsion of one of the most celebrated and ancient American peoples. So I think in here, certainly there is a real sorrow on behalf of de Tocqueville. You can sense it. But also this idea that Native Americans now, maybe for the first time, could be free. They could be on their own land away from everybody else. We're not going to have step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5, step 6, and even step 7, because they're going to be on their own, unmolested, to do what they want. That is certainly what Jackson said. Now, to get them there, did that make him, a guardian of the Constitution, a guardian of economic opportunity, a guardian of political democracy? That's for you guys to decide. But what we know is that the white people, they got their cotton growing land. And they actually got the gold on the Native American land. But what the Native Americans got is a chance to live their life away from all of that. So there you go. It's probably longer than I anticipated, but it always is. So next we're going to do the nullification crisis.